For those of you who don't know me, my name is Meredith Doig and I'm president of the Rationalist Society, which is Australia's oldest free thought group. Just a few housekeeping matters before we get going. I hope everybody knows how to use the chat box. So if you do have questions for our speaker, could you please jot them down in the chat box and we'll try to get to them. We'll work our way through them after the presentation. This webinar will be recorded, so if you do happen to miss any of it, we'll have it uploaded onto our YouTube channel later. And for next month, our webinar we'll have a very special guest who is a serving politician and who is a great supporter of secularism, but we'll tell you more about that later. Now for our guest speaker for tonight. Dr. Luke Beck is a leading scholar in the field of the separation of religion and government, i.e. secularism, separation of church and state, and also of religious freedom under the Australian Constitution. That was his PhD thesis. Section 116. So his main focus of his research is developing a much more sophisticated understanding of Section 116 of the Australian Constitution in terms of its history and its underlying purposes, its relationship and interaction with the broader Australian constitutional culture, and how it might best be interpreted and applied. Dr. Luke has been cited in judgments in the High Court of Australia, relied upon in arguments in other cases before the courts, including the High Court and the New South Wales Court of Appeal. His research has also been cited in reports of parliamentary inquiries and law reform commissions in Australia and overseas. So you can see, I think, that Luke is very well credentialed to give a presentation to us about challenging the religious discrimination in government chaplaincy programs. And Luke, over to you.
Thank you, Meredith, for the introduction, and thank you everybody for making the effort this evening to log on and to attend this presentation. And thank you, of course, to Meredith and the Rational Society for inviting me to speak. Tonight, I'm going to talk about challenging religious discrimination in government chaplaincy programs. So just a quick outline of how we'll structure tonight. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about what exactly are government chaplaincy programs, because that's a really important thing. There's a bit of a misunderstanding about what they're actually about. And then I'm going to talk to you about the nature of religious discrimination in these programs and what the RSA, the Rationalist Society, has been doing to challenge that built-in discrimination and try to get rid of that discrimination in school chaplains programs in various states, in hospital chaplains programs, and in military chaplains programs. And then towards the end of the presentation, I want to talk a little bit about what each of you as private individuals can do to help get rid of religious discrimination in these government-funded chaplaincy programs. And then I think we'll open it up to a bit of Q&A, so any questions you might have. So to start, what exactly are government chaplaincy programs? So government chaplaincy programs is just a label that I've used to put together the various chaplaincy programs that governments fund and run. And the lack of understanding, or perhaps the misunderstanding in the broader community about these programs, comes from the word chaplaincy and the job title chaplain. That job title is a little bit misleading, or really quite a lot misleading. Using the word chaplain really sometimes gets people to think that the work these people do is about religious ministry, and it's not. That's not what these jobs are about. Chaplaincy is sometimes referred to by other names. Sometimes it's called spiritual care. Sometimes it's called social health. Perhaps more often and more familiar to people, it can be called pastoral care. and that provides emotional and social support to people in a range of different settings. And governments across Australia fund chaplaincy programs in a range of different settings, in schools, in hospitals, in the military, in prisons, in the emergency services, so police, fire and ambulance, etc. But it's not the same as the counselling provided by trained psychologists. It's a different branch of allied health. So just as you have doctors and nurses and physiotherapists and speech pathologists, you can have counsellors and social workers and pastoral care workers. They all provide different kinds of support and care to people. And all of that is important for people's well-being and for the well-being of society as a whole. So if you thought that I was going to talk to you about how terrible chaplaincy programs are, I'm not. That's not what this presentation is about. Chaplaincy programs are not necessarily bad. At core, they're actually a really good idea. There are problems with them. There's need for reform. There's need to get rid of religious discrimination, but government-funded pastoral care in those kinds of settings is not necessarily a bad idea and can in fact be a really good idea and improve people's lives and well-being. There's a recent book by a British academical scholar called David Savage called Non-Religious Pastoral Care, a Practical Guide. And I've got a copy, I've got a picture of the front cover up on screen. And it's a really interesting book. And in the introduction, Professor Savage says, people with non-religious beliefs should have the same opportunities to access like-minded pastoral care as people with religious beliefs. And people with non-religious beliefs should have the same opportunities to provide that care. And there's two really important points in that quote. And I think those 2 points form the theme of tonight's presentation. Non-religious people, just like religious people, should have access to pastoral care provided by people they can connect with, just like religious people should have access to that kind of care. And people who are non-religious and who want to be those carers, to be those professionals, those carers to provide that support to people, they should have the same opportunity, the same job opportunities to do that as people who are religious and wish to do that. And interestingly, Professor Savage also points out that data shows that people who identify as non-religious don't access pastoral care to the same extent as people who identify as Christian, and that recruitment practices in chaplaincy departments in hospitals, schools, prisons, etc., prevent non-religious people from applying for jobs as pastoral carers. So this built-in discrimination takes away job opportunities in a discriminatory manner, and it has the effect of preventing patients, students, others accessing this kind of welfare support. And both of those things are problematic, I think. And so those are the two key themes that you'll see run through tonight's presentation. So the first aspect of government-funded chaplaincy programs in Australia I want to talk to you about tonight is the federal government's National School Chaplaincy Program, which has been around for quite a while. It was first introduced towards the tail end of the John Howard government. And this is the way it's structured is a little bit funny. It's a federal government program, but in practice implemented by the states. And this is a structure that the federal government uses for all kinds of programs. So the way it works in very general terms is that the federal government provides money to the states on condition that the states use that money to pay for school chaplains in accordance with broad guidelines set by the federal government. And those guidelines are set out in the project agreement for National School Chaplaincy Program signed by the federal and all the state education ministers. And I've got a little picture of the cover page of that government document just up in the corner there. And that federal government document signed by all the health ministers says that school chaplains will support the well-being of students through pastoral care services. And that's fleshed out a little bit more in the document and gives examples like running breakfast clubs, anti-bullying programs, referral supports, and that kind of thing. So that sounds like a really good idea, providing school students all around Australia with access to pastoral care. So that sounds like a good idea, even if the job titles might be a little bit silly. Schools then apply, individual schools or principals apply to their state education department if they want to participate and get funding to pay for a school chaplain in their school. But rather than hiring the chaplain as an employee of the school, in the same way that you might hire a teacher or a front office staff member, chaplains are hired through outsourcing arrangements. So schools enter into a contract with one of a variety of chaplaincy provider organisations. And those organisations are the ones who actually hire the chaplain, but the chaplain works in the school under the day-to-day direction of the school principal. Now, that's not necessarily a problem. School cleaners are hired in that kind of a manner too. The key problems are that the job ads for chaplain positions in public schools all require job applicants to be Christian. If you were to go online right now on any of the job ad websites and look for a school chaplain position, you will find a bunch of ads for school chaplains in government or public schools, and the selection criteria will say something like must be Christian or must be an active member of their local church, etc. So in other words, if you are an atheist or a Jew or a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Hindu or some other kind of non-Christian, you are not able to get a job in a public school to provide pastoral care to students, even if you are fully qualified. That's a problem. And that's even more problematic because it's unlawful. Most states in Australia make religious discrimination in employment unlawful. Refusing to hire somebody because of their religion is just as unlawful as refusing to hire somebody because they are a woman or because they are disabled or because they are gay. It's banned by state law in most states. So, what has the Rationalist Society been doing about this? So the Rationalist Society doesn't want to get rid of the school chaplains program. The Rationalist Society just wants to get rid of the discrimination built into the program so that anybody who is qualified can get these jobs if they're the best person for the job. And this is an ongoing campaign that the Rationalist Society has been running. And there's been 4 rounds so far of this campaign, and I want to talk you through them because they're quite interesting. Round 1 was a religious discrimination case in the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal. So sued the Victorian Education Department for religious discrimination. Round 2 was then a formal complaint to the Victorian Government Purchasing Board when the Victorian Education Department chose to not enforce its new rules. Round 3 was then a fresh complaint to the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. And round 4, the latest round, is a private member's bill in the Victorian Parliament. So to round 1 to start. Round 1 involved Juliet Armstrong, who you can see in the little snippet from the Saturday paper up in the corner there. With the support of the Rationalist Society, she sued the Victorian Education Department for religious discrimination. Now, Juliet Armstrong is not religious, but she had experience working as a school chaplain, as it happens in a Catholic school. And school chaplain jobs are all contract positions, so they run out after 12, 18 or 24 months. And so then you have to look for a new posting. So as her posting was coming to an end, she was looking around for her next school chaplaincy position and ran into a hurdle. All of the job ads, including the ones for the public schools, said must be Christian. And despite her qualifications, despite her experience, the fact that she wasn't Christian meant that she couldn't apply. So the Rationalist Society supported Juliet in bringing religious discrimination proceedings in the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal. Now, the case settled before going to full hearing and judgment, but after the case, the Victorian Education Department changed its school chaplains rules to expressly state chaplains may be of any faith or of no faith, which sounds reasonable. Problem when we get to round 2. Those new rules, chaplains can be of any faith or no faith, the Victorian Education Department chose to not enforce. Those rules are part of the binding contract between the Education Department and schools and the chaplaincy provider organisations. So not only is it a matter of discrimination law that you must not discriminate on the basis of religion, It's also now a matter of contract. It's in the contract. But nevertheless, all of the job ads for school chaplains in Victorian public schools still require applicants to be Christian. And you can go online and check that later on tonight if you want. So, round two, a complaint was lodged with the Victorian Government Purchasing Board. And the Victorian Government Purchasing Board is an obscure government agency in Victoria that you've probably never heard of before and probably never will again. But its job is to make sure that all government departments and agencies maintain their contracts in an appropriate way, make sure that the contracts they enter into with their various suppliers are in fact complied with. And in this case, it was pretty clear that the Education Department was not enforcing the contractual rules against its contractors. The Victorian Government Purchasing Board wrote back to the complainant, agreeing in writing, stating in express terms that there are apparent failures to comply with the Victorian Government Purchasing Board's policies. But the Victorian Government Purchasing Board said, despite the fact that we think there are failures to comply with obligations here, we are going to do nothing. Because after some discussion with the Education Department's lawyers, the Victorian Government Purchasing Board pointed out that only suppliers are allowed to lodge complaints with the Victorian Government Purchasing Board. And a supplier is just some other contractor. But all of the chaplaincy provider organisations in Victoria all do the same thing. They all have that selection criteria, must be Christian. So none of them are going to complain because they're the ones breaking the rules, and they're quite happy that the Victorian Education Department is turning a blind eye to that. So despite the fact that we have a government oversight body saying that this is in breach of the rules, the government oversight agency has said, actually, that's the case, but we're not going to look into it any further. We're not going to do anything, which is obviously just a little bit disappointing. So what do we do then? Round three was to make a fresh complaint to the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. Under Victoria's anti-discrimination law, which is called the Equal Opportunity Act, that imposes a number of legal obligations. Firstly, of course, it makes religious discrimination unlawful, but it also imposes a duty on government departments to take positive steps to eliminate religious discrimination. So not only must you not engage in religious discrimination, you must also take positive steps as far as you can to get rid of religious discrimination wherever you see it and have some influence. And obviously the Education Department in this case has influence over what its contractors do because it's the one choosing to turn a blind eye to them not complying with the rules. So a complaint was lodged with the Human Rights Commission in Victoria against the Victorian Education Department for failing to comply with its duty to eliminate religious discrimination. So this was not a religious discrimination complaint like round one. This was a complaint about the department failing to take positive steps to eliminate discrimination. We found out that the Rational Society found out that on the 20th of January 2020, that is last year, that the Human Rights Commission held a sit-down meeting with the Department of Education to discuss this issue because they held concerns about what was going on with the school chaplains program in Victoria. The Human Rights Commissioner herself, not one of her underlings, but the Commissioner herself wrote to a Victorian politician saying, "We agree that the school chaplains program may be in breach of the Equal Opportunity Act." But again, like the Victorian Government Purchasing Board, this government agency says in writing, we think something dodgy and against the rules is going on here, but we are choosing to do nothing about it. The Commission chose to not launch a formal investigation. It chose to not take any official action, even though it had formed the view and said expressly in writing that they think the rules are being broken. They chose to do nothing. So round four. Round four, the most recent round, is Private Members Bill in the Victorian Parliament. Fiona Patten, MLC, a member of the Victorian Upper House and the leader of the Reason Party, introduced a Private Members Bill in the Victorian Parliament. And that bill would change the law to require schools to hire chaplains directly rather than through outsourcing arrangements. Now, we shouldn't need a new law to get rid of the religious discrimination in the school chaplains program because religious discrimination is already unlawful. But that doesn't seem to be that law seems to be being ignored, and despite the fact that all the agencies say that there's a breach of the rules. Now, this Private Members Bill has not been brought on for debate yet, so it's still sort of sitting there waiting to progress, if indeed it does progress. But the logic of having this second piece of law, this second law, if it in fact passes, was explained by Fiona Patten in her second reading speech. In that speech, she said, the department might be willing to look the other way when its contractors tell potential job applicants, sorry, you don't have a reference from a church minister. But Victorian public schools would never themselves put out a job ad saying Christians only. Victorian public schools themselves would never tell a potential job applicant, no Muslims, no atheists, no Jews. This bill will make public schools hire youth workers, or chaplains if we must call them that, directly. A public school or the education department would never actually put out a job ad saying no Jews, no Muslims, no atheists. So if you change the law to force schools to hire chaplains directly, this, you hope, would prevent the religious discrimination in the hiring practices. So that's where we're at with the Victorian version of the National School Chaplaincy Program. A number of government agencies, oversight and integrity bodies have said in writing that what is happening is against the rules. But all of those bodies say, despite the fact that it is against the rules, we choose to take no action. That is obviously incredibly disappointing, but that is where we're at. But what about, so that's Victoria, but what about other states? The school chaplains program exists in other states as well, and religious discrimination is also unlawful in most other states, including in Tasmania, Western Australia, and Queensland. So what have we been doing there? In Tasmania, the Rationalist Society lodged a complaint with the oversight body called Equal Opportunity Tasmania about the religious discrimination in the school chaplains program because it works exactly the same way in Tasmania. You've got these outsourcing arrangements. They put out job ads that say it must be Christian. The Commissioner of Equal Opportunity Tasmania refused to take any action and suggested that the Rationalist Society should talk to the Minister for Education in Tasmania directly, which is disappointing. It is the job of Equal Opportunity Tasmania to take action where there is religious discrimination, particularly when the government is the one perpetrating it. But on the Commissioner's advice, the Rationalist Society has now approached the Tasmanian Minister directly and Education Department directly and is now awaiting a reply. I'm not overly confident that that reply will be positive, but pressure is being put on the authorities. The fact that the law bans religious discrimination is being pointed out very clearly to the authorities, and we can hope perhaps that some action will be taken. The situation in Western Australia is slightly more promising. In Western Australia, the Rationalist Society again made a complaint about religious discrimination in the school chaplains program in WA to the West Australian Equal Opportunity Commissioner. The Commissioner wrote back to the Rationalist Society saying, I agree that under the Equal Opportunity Act, such a selection criteria is prima facie religious conviction discrimination in the areas of employment and advertisements. Further, as the educational authority is the Department of Education, none of the Act's religious exceptions that might be relied upon by a private educational institution apply. So we have here in writing the WA Equal Opportunity Commissioner saying, this looks like unlawful religious discrimination to me. But the Commissioner has said he will not take any further steps. He will not launch a formal investigation until a complaint has first been lodged directly with the WA Education Department. So, accordingly, the Rational Society has lodged a complaint with the West Australian Department of Education and is waiting to hear back. Now, there's some prospect here, even if the department fobs off the Rational Society, which is probably where I'd be putting my money if I was a betting man. The Commissioner has said in writing he thinks there's a breach and that he may well look at it if the department refuses to take action. So there is some prospect here in Western Australia about some action actually being taken about religious discrimination. Because religious discrimination is bad, people should not be discriminated against on the basis of their religion. Queensland is a slightly different outcome. Queensland also has a law against religious discrimination. So the Rational Society wrote a letter to the Queensland Human Rights Commission complaining about the religious discrimination in the Queensland version of the School Chaplains program, which operates in exactly the same way as the program operates in all of the other states. The Queensland Commissioner for Human Rights wrote back saying, not only do I agree that there's probably a breach here, I'm going to do something. He wrote, in response to your letter, I will write to the Department of Education to suggest changes to the School Chaplains program addressing the potential contraventions of the Queensland Anti-Discrimination Act. So he not only agrees that there are potential breaches of the law, he's suggested actual change to the department about what they can do to get rid of those breaches of law. Now, the Commissioner in his letter to the Rational Society did not say what his suggested changes are. And this happened only a very short time ago. You'll see the date on the letter is February 2021. So we will wait and see what, if anything, actually changes. But I think you can rest assured that the Rational Society will be following up with the Queensland Department of Education and the Queensland Human Rights Commissioner to find out what his suggestions were and what the department's reaction to those suggestions were. So there is some potential prospect for change in Queensland. But overall, it is a pretty disappointing picture when you have a government-funded program to provide care and support to school kids, which is a really good idea, where that program has built-in religious discrimination. Religious discrimination is bad generally, but in a public school program, I think it's even especially worse. What kind of message does that send to young people in Australia that religious discrimination is okay? It's happening in their schools. It's sending the very wrong message to young people. We should not be sending a message to students in public schools that it's okay to discriminate against people on the basis of their religion. I don't think that's a fair go for people. And as it happens, as I pointed out, it's quite probably unlawful. So that's what the Rational Society has been doing on the school chaplains front. There's also, of course, chaplains in hospitals, serving patients, providing pastoral care and support to patients. Some hospitals, in fact, have or have had non-religious chaplains. A couple of years ago, ABC Radio National's Soul Search program had an episode about non-religious pastoral care in public hospitals, featuring an interview with Joe C. here, who was a non-religious pastoral carer, and you can see him in the little screenshot I've got there from the ABC RN website. But it's actually very hard to get a job as a non-religious pastoral care worker in a hospital, including in public hospitals, because almost all pastoral care roles in hospitals are reserved for religious people. And if you think back to that book I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, that's unfair to people who want to provide pastoral care services to patients who happen to not be religious. Why should they be locked out of that profession? And it's unfair to patients who might not want to see a special Christian pastoral care worker. They might actually want to see a non-religious pastoral care worker because that aligns with their worldview, bearing in mind that a good proportion of Australians are not religious. What about them? They get sick and go to hospital too. So you got to look, the starting point is to look at the rules. And in Victoria, there's a government agency called Safer Care Victoria, and its job is healthcare quality and safety improvement. And Safer Care Victoria endorsed guidelines for quality spiritual care in Victoria. And spiritual care is the term that they're using for pastoral care. It means the same thing, if you think back to what I said at the very beginning of my presentation. Now, those guidelines appeared to limit public hospital and healthcare chaplaincy jobs to religious people. In other words, if you are not religious, you don't meet the guidelines or the official professional standards for being a pastoral care worker in public hospitals. So I wrote an email to Safer Care Victoria, pointing out that those guidelines appear to contravene Victoria's laws against religious discrimination in employment, and that endorsing those guidelines appears to contravene Victoria's laws against authorising, assisting, or encouraging religious discrimination, because Safer Care Victoria doesn't hire chaplains, the hospitals and healthcare providers do. By setting these standards or endorsing these standards, Safer Care Victoria is saying, this is how we want you to do it. You're encouraging other people to break the law, and that itself is unlawful. They wrote back to me and said, oh gosh, you're right. We'll change the guidelines and we'll insert express provisions making clear that there is to be no religious discrimination. In section 1, they inserted, this care, referring to pastoral care, is delivered by qualified and credentialed spiritual health practitioners who can be of any faith or of no faith. That's good. All spiritual care, and then at section 6.9, all spiritual care practitioners meet the requirements for certification according to industry standards and can be of any faith or of no faith. That's pretty good. Everybody can get a job as a pastoral care worker in a hospital, provided you're appropriately credentialed and qualified. On the weekend, when I was making the slides for tonight's presentation, I went onto the website to get a picture of the guidelines so I could post it up on that previous slide that you saw. But something curious happened.
Luke, you've frozen.
When I opened up the current version of it, am I back?
You are back. Yes, go ahead.
So when I looked on the website, something curious happened. Both of those statements are no longer in the guidelines. They cannot be seen anywhere. So at the end of 2019, in December 2019, Safer Care Victoria wrote to me saying, we are inserting these words. They even included the document as an attachment. Here they are. Problem fixed. I thought, great, win. And I was going to tell you all about this win tonight. But then when I looked on Saturday to get just a screenshot of the front cover for a picture, both of those statements were no longer there. There was no express mention anywhere in the guidelines of people of no faith. So first thing Monday morning, I sent off, please explain to Safer Care Victoria, and I'm waiting to hear back. It is very curious. You can accept that, maybe it was an oversight or a mistake up front to leave out these statements. But once it's been brought to their attention and they've said, oh gosh, yes, here's the fix, that, another 12 months later, it's disappeared. That's extraordinarily curious, extraordinarily curious. So we're now back at a position where the Victorian government endorsed guidelines for pastoral care in public hospitals give the impression that non-religious people are disqualified from working as pastoral carers in public hospitals. It's very odd. We'll wait to see what happens with that one. But it's not just schools and hospitals that have chaplains, it's also the military. The Australian Army, the Royal Australian Navy, and the Royal Australian Air Force each employ chaplains to provide pastoral support and care to defence personnel and sometimes also their families. But interestingly, the majority of defence personnel are not religious. So Australian Defence Force personnel are even less religious than the general population, which I think is a very interesting statistic. But to get a job as a chaplain in the military, or at least in the army, you have to be from one of a select number of religious groups. And I've got from the Defence Jobs website a screenshot from the Army chaplains job advertisement. And in order to get a job as a chaplain in the army, as well as having appropriate other qualifications, you must be from an endorsed denomination or faith group. And those are Anglicans, Catholics, Uniting Church, Presbyterians, Baptists, Lutherans, Churches of Christ, Salvation Army, Australian Christian Churches, and Council of Jury. So if you are some other kind of Christian, you can't get a job as a pastoral carer in the army. If you're a Hindu, a Buddhist, a Muslim, or a Buddhist, you can't get a job as a chaplain or pastoral carer in the army. And if you're an atheist or not agnostic, you certainly can't get a job as a pastoral carer in the army, even though more than half of army personnel are not religious. No focused pastoral care for them. The logic is that these Christians and the odd Jew can provide pastoral care to non-Christians as well as to people of their own faith. So a guy called Justin Murray, who worked as a volunteer non-religious pastoral carer at Canberra Hospital in the ACT, he lodged a complaint with the Australian Human Rights Commission about the religious discrimination involved in hiring military chaplains. And there was a couple of articles in the papers about this at the time. And in one of those articles, Justin Murray is quoted as saying, "I'm concerned about people in the armed services not getting access to something others who are religious get access to," which is a similar point to the point that I mentioned from the book earlier on in the proceedings. And religious discrimination under federal law is a bit of a complex situation. Religious discrimination in government jobs is banned by the federal constitution, by section 116 of the constitution. The Federal Fair Work Act bans firing people on the basis of religion, but there's no general federal law about hiring people on the basis of religion. But nevertheless, the Australian Human Rights Commission still has power to investigate and conciliate complaints of religious discrimination in employment. And that's what it did in this case. And we'll get to what happened afterwards in a moment. A few weeks ago now, a colonel in the army, Colonel Philip Hoagland, Conspicuous Service Cross, wrote an article in the Army's magazine called The Forge, titled "Losing Our Religion, the ADF's Chaplaincy Dilemma." And Colonel Hoagland said, "Evidence exists to suggest that non-religious defence members would not seek support from religious chaplains. This means that a significant proportion of defence members are effectively unsupported by the existing chaplaincy model." The colonel went on to say, with 56% of defence members no longer affiliated with a religion, a proportion that is predicted to increase to 3/4 of the ADF permanent force population by 2030, the current religion-based chaplaincy model will soon be obsolescent in providing well-being support and pastoral care. Consequently, there's a rapidly emerging requirement to transition away from an exclusively Christian-dominated chaplaincy model to a secular pastoral care model. So this is an issue that is being thought about inside the Defence Force. This isn't just something activists and outsiders are talking about. This is something that's being thought about and talked about inside the Defence Force. So that's a positive development. You can't fix a problem unless you first start talking about a problem. There has been some progress. Early last year, the Royal Australian Navy announced that it would be introducing a new job called Maritime Spiritual Wellbeing Officers. That is non-religious chaplains, non-religious pastoral care workers. So there has been progress. In the Royal Australian Navy, there are now non-religious chaplains, which is good. But the Australian Army and the Royal Australian Air Force still refuse to hire non-religious chaplains. That situation is obviously untenable. If you can have non-religious chaplains in the Navy, then why can't you have non-religious chaplains in the Army and the Air Force? There's no difference. So my prediction is that in time, and perhaps not that long, the Army and the Air Force will be forced to follow suit and hire non-religious chaplains, Just as sailors, non-religious sailors now have access to appropriate pastoral care support, non-religious soldiers and non-religious aviators should be entitled to have access to appropriate pastoral care support too. We'll watch that space. I do notice the time and we are approaching sort of the 3-quarter mark. I wanted to talk briefly about what you can do to help remove religious discrimination from government-funded chaplaincy programs. So in the context of school chaplains, one thing you can do is write a letter or an email to your state Minister for Education. And to help you out, I've got their states, their names and their email addresses right there on the slide for you. And the key message, if you choose to do this, would be that all students, regardless of religious affiliation, should have equal access to pastoral care. That school chaplains should be hired on merit, not on the basis of religious affiliation. And ask the minister, what will you do to make sure there's no religious discrimination in hiring school chaplains in your state? And it's important to do this. Correspondence, letters, emails, phone calls to ministers and to politicians actually matter. Ministers are, at the end of the day, politicians, and they want to stay in power. They want to win the next election. And if they believe that the public is interested in an issue and that there's pressure, that there's concern, people are watching and agitating for change, they might be more inclined to do it. So the more people who write to the ministers, the better. It's not just for groups like the Rationalist Society and others to campaign in this space. There's space for ordinary people to make an effort. There's space for ordinary people to achieve results. And similarly, for the case with hospital chaplains, you can write to your state Minister for Health. And again, I have their names and email addresses there on the screen to help you out. And the key messages, if you choose to do that, are essentially the same. All patients, regardless of religious affiliation, should have equal access to pastoral care. Hospital chaplains should be hired on merit, not on the basis of religious affiliation. And ask the minister, what will you actually do? What steps will you take to make sure there is no religious discrimination in hiring hospital chaplains? And similarly, with military chaplains, there's only one minister this time because obviously the military is federal. And that is to write to the Federal Minister for Defence Personnel, who is Darren Chester, and there is his email address. And the key messages here are pretty much the same. All defence personnel, soldiers, sailors, aviators, regardless of religious affiliation, should have equal access to pastoral care. The Navy now has non-religious chaplains. So, Minister, what steps will you take to make sure that the Army and the Royal Australian Air Force follow the Navy's lead and introduce non-religious chaplains? Again, federal politicians are just like state politicians. They need your votes, they need the public's votes, and they care about what the public think and what issues are important to the public. If ministers and politicians think that there's an issue out there, but no one's really particularly interested in it, it won't be particularly high on their priority list. The more people contact politicians and ministers about issues, the higher that issue goes on the politician's priority list, and the more likely it is that action might be taken. So ordinary people can have an impact on policy. It's not just advocacy groups and others. Ordinary people can achieve real world policy change, and it's important to give it a go, I think. I would encourage you to do that. If you're interested in the idea of non-religious chaplaincy or pastoral care, there's a bunch of organisations and groups who are involved, but there's a new one, a relatively new one called Social Health Australia, and they have a website which you can check out, socialhealthaustralia.org. They have a bunch of information, and they also have a referral service. If you're a non-religious person or even a religious person who wants non-religious pastoral care, they can provide referrals. And if you're interested in supporting that, they also have a donation base. It's a charity, of course. And finally, I mean, I should probably also, since the Rationalist Society has invited me to speak, plug the Rationalist Society. There's their website, You can sign up for their newsletters and donate if you wish. But in the remaining, I think, 9 minutes we have, I thought we should open it up to audience questions and answers.
Luke, thank you. We do have a number of questions that have, or some comments and some questions that have been written in the chat box. So what I'm going to do is go through those one by one. We've got about 10 minutes left, and we may not be able to get through all of them. So if participants do have to leave, then please feel free to do that. Just to remind you, we'll make sure that Luke's slides are made available, and this session is being recorded. So in due course, that will be available as well. So with that, Colin Acton is here. Colin, I wonder whether you were saying, given the undertaking that Defence took in 2019, offering Navy's secular support option, what does it mean that Army and Air Force have just given a damn good ignoring? How is it possible to hold the whole ADF to account? Colin, would you like to unmute and just introduce yourself?
Yep, Colin Acton. So I was the DG chap at the time who brought the...
you might have to explain what that is.
The Director General of Navy Chaplaincy. So I was the lead chaplain in Navy. Mm-hmm. And it was, I guess, that plan to introduce non-religious pastoral care is something that was had been on my mind for a long time. And really it wasn't until I got in that job where I could actually bring that about. But there was a lot of resistance, of course, from churches and from the Religious Advisory Committee to the services. So Defence pay a high-level group of bishops and bishop equivalents from a number of different religious groups to sit on a Defence committee and pay them handsomely to do so, to provide religious advice to Defence. They were nothing but a major roadblock and a problem. But nevertheless, we got that through. And one of the undertakings the undertaking that was sent to Justin was that Defence as a whole would move ahead with this. But I mean, my concern has been Defence have just given a damn good ignoring. But it sounds like lots of groups, Victoria and Tasmania and other states have done the same thing. And there doesn't appear to be a whole lot we can do to hold them to account.
Other than, as Luke says, getting more of a grassroots movement, people who are concerned, just keeping on writing to their MPs. I mean, it's true that MPs have got a lot on their plates, and if they don't have, if their constituents don't raise issues with them, it's just not on their list of priorities. So we can try all we can through the methods that we've been using, but it really does take individuals to write to their MPs. Colin, if it's okay, I'm going to move on.
Cool, no worries, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Colin. Judy Crawford said, any comment on religions other than Christians applying to chaplaincy? I think that was covered by...
just very briefly, yeah. So as we saw with the Army chaplains, they have Jewish chaplains. They'll accept Jewish chaplains, but they won't accept Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist or atheist at the moment. So in practice, with school chaplains, for example, if you look online at school chaplain vacancy ads, they all basically say must be Christian.
Luke, can I just interject there? It's Colin Acton again. Navy have an imam. We have a Muslim chaplain. I think Army were also trying to recruit an Islamic and a Hindu. So that RACS group now have Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist and Muslim representation. And their view of diversity is having one or two of those minority faiths within the 140 full-time chaplains, just to make things sound okay. But they are moving ahead with that, with those other faith groups. I don't think Army or Air Force have anything other than Jewish chaplains, but Navy certainly has an imam.
So Navy seems to be the most progressive of the armed forces in this respect, it seems.
Jeff Lerner asks, and I'm going to take this as a rhetorical question, how did they get away with this discrimination? That's what we want.
Because all of the oversight agencies choose to do nothing about it. They have full power to take action, and they've made a series of conscious decisions to do nothing.
Alison Cortis from Queensland Parents for State Schools Welcome, Alison. Alison, would you like to ask your question? You said, Luke, you say that chaplain work is not about religious ministry, and you've got a comment about what's happening in Queensland.
So Scripture Union Queensland is the largest employer of school chaplains in Australia, and it says in their actual job description for chaplaincy that it is Christian ministry. Also, they give tax-deductible receipts for donation to chaplaincy on the ATO condition that chaplaincy donation is for the sole purpose of providing RI in government schools, and likely so do all the other providers. So how can chaplaincy not be about religious ministry just on these issues?
Yeah, so some of these organisations like Scripture Union Queensland, who's one of the major providers, one of the major chaplaincy outsource organisations, they kind of do two things. They do religious instruction RI, which back when I was in school we called scripture, but they also do chaplaincy. So under the National School Chaplaincy Program, the rules are very clear that it is not religious ministry, but the same organisations also actually do religious ministry.
There's no Scripture Union does not religious.
And occasionally
Scripture Union does not provide religious instruction in Queensland state schools.
And then we used to see reports in federal parliament, through federal parliament and Senate estimates process, where some school chaplains from some providers were in fact breaching the rules and in fact proselytizing and doing things in the nature of religious ministry, which is what they're not meant to do. The rules are very clear. Now, interestingly, a few years ago, the Federal Department of Education stopped collating statistics on the number of complaints about school chaplains and the statistics about the faith affiliations of the school chaplains, because those statistics were a little bit embarrassing, and every time the senators asked for them to be released, that caused a degree of embarrassment. Well, if you have embarrassing statistics, you can stop the embarrassment by stop collecting them. So the Federal Education Department, it seems, no longer collects those kinds of stats. But if you read the National School Chaplaincy Program funding agreement, project agreement between the Commonwealth and the states, it's very clear that it's not about religious ministry. Or that said, if you're funding these religious groups to do something that is not religious, there might be a bit of a wink and a nudge going on. But on paper, officially, the rules are not religious ministry.
Thanks. I'm going to move on, Alison, if that's okay. Vicky Caulfield from Perth draws attention to the loophole being the outsourcing arrangements. So do you want to just clarify, Luke, why it is that even with the outsourcing arrangements, it's still unlawful?
Yeah, so outsourcing doesn't get you around religious discrimination. If you're running a small business as a sole trader, you are not allowed to engage in religious discrimination or sex discrimination, etc., when you're hiring your staff. But equally, if you get your staff from a temp agency, which is an outsourcing arrangement, that temp agency isn't allowed to engage in religious discrimination or sex discrimination or racial discrimination. The ban on religious discrimination applies across the board with some very limited exceptions. For example, if you're hiring a priest, of course, if you're hiring a priest for the local Catholic parish, they're going to be Catholic. That's fair enough. But if you're hiring a youth worker for a government school, who cares what their religion is? Their religion is totally irrelevant to the work. It's pastoral care in a public school in a non-religious setting. So there's no exception that authorizes religious discrimination in that context. So it doesn't matter if there's outsourcing or not outsourcing. If you're going to patent bill that would ban outsourcing in Victoria for school chaplains, isn't about closing off the loophole in any legal sense. It's about the moral action. A school, a public school, the Department of Education, would never put its logo on a job ad that said, no Muslims, no Jews, no atheists. They would feel bad morally and feel embarrassed by doing that. So they wouldn't actually do that. But they're happy to look the other way when their outsourced agency does it, even though that's still unlawful. So it's really a moral loophole, I think, rather than a legal loophole.
Okay. Kerry Lovering says, has anybody approached the minister?
The Victorian minister? Yeah, so we've approached the Victorian department. The Racial Society's approached the Victorian department because they're the ones sort of managing this, and then through the Victorian Government Purchasing Board and the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. It's been debated in Parliament. There have been questions on notice asked in Parliament of the Minister by upper house MPs from the crossbench. So the Minister is aware and has been asked about it, yes. But, you know, the proof is always in the pudding. The proof is always in what is done. And if you look at job ads right now for school chaplains in Victorian public schools, they're all restricted to people who are Christian.
I'm conscious that we've got 1 minute left and there are 16 new messages. So I just want to say to people where we haven't got to their questions, we might go over by about 10 minutes, if that's okay, Luke. For those of you who don't want to stay, that's fine. We fully understand. But in order to get through a few more questions, I think we'll just extend this by 10 minutes. Is that okay with you, Luke?
Yeah, absolutely.
The next comment or question is from Stuart McLean. I think it's not Stuart McLean. There's a thing about his name. Is this all beside the point if the federal government is introducing religious laws? Sorry, Adrian.
Adrian.
Yes. Thanks, Adrian. Do you want to ask your question of Luke?
Oh, sorry. Because I'm using a mobile phone, I haven't got it in front of me again. Could you just read it for me?
I'll read it out for you. Is this all beside the point if the federal government is introducing religious freedom laws? I think you mean the Religious Discrimination Bill, with the Australian Christian Lobby and Hillsong and so on, like Mark Latham's bill, to not affirm trans children in schools, etc.
That's a really interesting question. So one of the consequences of the Religious Discrimination Bill would be, so religious discrimination is already unlawful in Victoria, in Queensland, in Western Australia and Tasmania and the ACT and the Northern Territory. There are already state-based religious discrimination laws. It is currently unlawful in every state except for two to discriminate against somebody on the ground of religion. But there's no federal overarching law in the same way that there's a federal and state version of sex discrimination laws, for example. But if we were to have a federal religious discrimination bill, like they released a second draft of early last year, one of the consequences of that bill, which I don't think they've realized, is that it would actually there would be another law that makes the school chaplains program and the religious discrimination involved in that unlawful, because the religious discrimination bill, the first part of the bill is just a stock standard anti-discrimination law that says you must not discriminate against people on the ground of religion and in employment, and in government programs. So there would then be a federal law saying the school chaplains program, the religious discrimination involved is unlawful, in the same way that the consequence of the state-based religious discrimination laws is that the religious discrimination involved in the hiring is unlawful. So that wouldn't actually change. Now, the second half of the religious discrimination bill is all the weird provisions that allow religious people and others to do nasty things and harass and intimidate people they don't like. But that wouldn't actually change the bare bones, basic must not discriminate against people part. On the ground of religion, it would allow you to discriminate against people on the grounds of sex or sexuality, for example, which seeks to override those protections, but there would still be a standard must not discriminate on the ground of religious discrimination. So if the federal government moved ahead in that space, and they might or they might not, I don't actually think that would put an end to this. That would actually give more ammunition for the Rationalist Society's campaign to get rid of the religious discrimination and make sure that everyone who's qualified can be hired based on merit rather than based on religion.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. Julia from Queensland said she's dumbfounded that so many agencies and presumably well-paid commissioners simply refuse to do their job. Yes, I think we're all a bit stunned. And then a specific question, do we know what changes to the program were suggested by the Human Rights Commission in Queensland? I think the answer to that is no, Luke.
No, we don't.
No.
We know that changes were suggested, but we don't know what those changes were. So that's something that needs to be followed up. But that's a very good question and a very important question. And I think in due course, when the Rationalist Society finds that information out, and given that it exists in paper form and there's freedom of information laws, etc., the Rationalist Society will find that out. I think there might at some point be a story on the Rationalist Society website giving a bit more detail about that, perhaps.
Jeff Lerner asks, how about formal complaints against the commissioners, presumably the Equal Opportunity Commissioners and the Anti-Discrimination Commissioners, for failing to carry out their mandated roles? Could you complain to, say, the Ombudsman?
So it's very difficult. There are complex rules governing complaints about integrity bodies, you generally can't use one integrity body to complain against another integrity body. So that's a complex question and something that I think is worth investigating, worth looking into. I think that's a useful suggestion.
Thank you. Colin McKay and Philip Hoagland had, I think, provide some information regarding what's going on in Army between the Psychology Corps and the Chaplains Corps. I think we'll just take that as informational, if that's okay. Stella asked, will the slides be available? The answer is yes. John Barrell. John, would you like to, are you still with us? Would you like to unmute and ask your question? Not sure that John is still with us, but his question was, how can you be a non-believer and also be spiritual?
Yeah, I suppose that's a really good question because, you know, in Victoria, they call pastoral carers in hospitals spiritual care practitioners. So it depends how you want to define the word spiritual. So some people sort of read the word spiritual and just think that's kind of a generic word for religious. In these contexts, it's not about religion necessarily. It can be, but it's much, much broader. It's about worldviews, sense of being, sense of belonging. I'm not an expert in this at all. As Meredith said in the introduction, I'm a constitutional lawyer. But it's about those kinds of things. You know, we all have a sense of belonging. We all have worldviews. You know, so in that sense of the word is what it's being used. So it's about pastoral care. You can be non-religious and need pastoral care because you're going through tough times due to various circumstances, health, bullying at school, whatever it might be. So pastoral care is something that's valuable and useful to everybody, regardless of your belief system. And there's lots of, you know, peer-reviewed research backing that up.
There's a question again from Alison. Do we know whether the hospital and military chaplains are outsourced?
No, they're not. So chaplains in the military are employed, engaged directly by the armed forces in the same way any other military officer is engaged. Now, the nature of their work obviously differs from other types of officer in the army, but they're hired directly by the military in the same way that other military personnel are hired. So they're directly engaged. They're, in effect, public servants in the same way that other military personnel are.
So they're engaging in direct discrimination.
Correct.
That's not good.
Which is presumably why the Australian
talking to each other about direct versus indirect discrimination.
Which is presumably why the Australian Human Rights Commission took on Justin Murray's complaint and went through the confidential conciliation process, because it does look rather open and shut, doesn't it?
It does, very much so.
Another question from Chris Paulson. Luke, do you have a preferred alternative name for chaplain or chaplaincy?
I think that's probably a decision that would need to be made by the experts in this field, and possibly you would use different names in different contexts. So in a school, you might want to say a student wellbeing officer, whereas in a hospital, you might want to use you wouldn't use student wellbeing because it's not students. So I think, you know, different names for different contexts.
Thank you. I'm going to wind up, so I might just do 2 or 3 more questions. From Jean Eli from the Dogs group. We think the only way forward is to not have chaplains at all, taking the job of well-qualified guidance officers. In the day, a guidance officer had to teach for 6 years and then undergo extensive training. I suppose that was previously. Non-preferential interpretation of Section 116 will let in the compromises. Separation is in the final analysis is the only way forward.
Yeah, so so guidance officer might be a good job title for school chaplains. So as I said at the very beginning, chaplaincy in this government sense is not meant to be about religious ministry. It's meant to be about pastoral care, or, you know, if that's language from back in the day, you know, guidance officer type work. So I think, you know, that might actually be a better job title for that. And, you know, the position that the Rationalist Society is advancing is that providing pastoral care to students and patients and military personnel, etc., is a great idea. Who cares what the job title is, but providing that service to people is a good thing. And that service should be provided on a non-discriminatory basis, on equal terms to everybody. And the people who provide that service, the people who work in those jobs, should be hired based only on merit, not based on their religion, not based on their sex, not based on their race, etc., etc. So
okay, I'm going to make this the last question, because it circles back to your speciality, Luke. Is there any chance that the policy to hire only religious chaplains contradicts Section 116 of the Constitution?
In the context of military chaplains, yes, absolutely. The Constitution, the fourth clause of Section 116, banning religious tests for officers under the Commonwealth, that essentially means you must not engage in religious discrimination for federal government jobs. And so it rather looks like the way the military hires most of its chaplains at the moment involves religious discrimination, and that would be in breach of Section 116 of the Constitution, absolutely. But on the fourth clause of Section 116, that is the religious test clause. But of course, running a constitutional case requires going to the courts. That requires having very expensive lawyers, etc. So, but you know, as Justin Murray's complaint to the Australian Human Rights Commission demonstrated, there are other mechanisms for agitating these issues in a way that's much less expensive and, or in fact, zero cost, in a way that makes it accessible to people who are the victims of discrimination.
Luke, I think we do have to pull this to an end. There's another 32 messages, so we'll make sure that you get those. I wonder if you could unshare your screen. Thank you. And for those of you who know how to do this, down at the bottom of your screen, there is the reactions icon. Could we all please put our hands together and say thank you very much to Luke for a really informative and fluent presentation. Thank you all for bearing with us. As I say, this is the first of our new style webinars, and we hope that that's been informative. If any of you have a burning desire to have us bring in an expert in a particular area, please do drop me a note and we'll see what we can do about that. As I say, I'd encourage you to look on our website for our next month's webinar, which will be with a sitting MP. And I can assure you that this person is going to be a terrific proponent of secularism. For those of you who are really interested in getting a more genuinely secular Australia, please don't miss our next month's webinar. With that, it just remains for me to say thank you all for coming along, and we will make sure that the slides from Luke's presentation are made available to you, and eventually the recording of the whole presentation. So thank you, everybody, and good night.